gentlemen, like to take a seat.
Order! Order!
Settle down in the cheap seats. Just a few announcements before we start this evening's talk. Forthcoming attractions on the 15th of September, we have the Candlelight Club's 15th anniversary ball.
On the 20th of September.
20th September, sorry.
That's the 15th anniversary on the 20th.
Yeah.
The 20th on the 15th.
Oh no, now it's in my head the wrong way round.
All is confusion. 24th of October, we have Dickon Edwards' book launch. It's extracts from his diary. He's been doing a blog since 1997, so one of the very first blogs on the internet. On the 8th of November, we are...
That's not here, is it? The Dickon one?
Hmm?
The Dickon one is not here, is it? It's somewhere else.
No, it's not here. It's
Oh, no,
we're
no.
organising it. It's a place called Boogaloo in Highgate.
Yes, separate to this club. On the 8th of November, it's supposed to be the Czech Winter Olympics. Whether that happens or not is anyone's guess, I think.
There's a planning meeting happening in September, so I suspect it is going to happen.
Oh, okay.
I think so. The whole fundraising, crowd raising is just, it's not necessary. It's just him trying to get money in his pocket as early as possible.
Never.
Don't forget you're streaming this, like.
Anybody that receives advance notice of a definite Olympiad, could they tell me rather than keep it to themselves? Because
Well, it's the 8th of November at a place in Ballon.
Where the ball was that.
secret place. Right,
It's not a
okay.
secret.
There'll be a lot of Polish confessions.
Anyway, and the next month's talk is next month's meeting, is slightly earlier, in the month 17th of September. And Seth DeVos, who some of you may know, will talk on his latest book, London Clubland, A Companion for the Curious. And now for tonight's talk, delighted to welcome Aidan, who will talk about origins of Dungeons and Dragons.
So, let's start to check. We're all at least familiar with what the concept of Dungeons and Dragons is.
Racist!
It's a tabletop role-playing game in which players take on the roles of adventurers, delving into dungeons, slaying monsters, acquiring loot. It's a lot of fun.
Some Lord of the Rings style.
Yes,
kind of thing.
in a fantasy setting, of course. If you don't know, feel free to take a nap. I won't be offended. So, Dungeons and Dragons was first published in 1974 by TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, written by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Since then, it has, influenced a new genre of gaming, role-playing games, as it also influenced books, TV, 2 films, don't watch the first one, it's rubbish, video games, and popular series on the web. So what I want to do with this talk is to describe, where did it come from? And of course, chart the evolution of its key concepts. Do you have the clicker thingy? Oh, okay.
Oh, we'll get the clicker.
Yes, so Dungeons and Dragons originated from tabletop wargaming in the American Midwest. What I think separates it from its wargaming roots is the identification of one player with one character, the fantasy setting, as you said, Lord of the Rings, Michael Moorcock, Paul Anderson, sense of continuity between sessions into a campaign like episodes in a long-running series, a sense of character progression, so characters becoming more powerful, thank you, with more powerful as they gain experience in slaying monsters, acquiring loot, and whenever the dungeon master feels like it. And the sense of open-ended gameplay in which almost anything can be attempted as long as it's adjudicated by the referee, or the dungeon master as we call them. So as I said, its origins lie in tabletop wargaming, which means that we must start, of course, with our good friends, the Prussians.
Obviously, we get to them soon.
Yes. So in the early 19th century, one Georg Leopold von Reiswitz develops something called Kriegspiel, the war game. This is taken up by his son, Georg Heinrich Rudolf Johann von Reiswitz, and with a name like that, you're destined to be an officer in the Prussian army. This was intended as a training tool for Prussian officers. 2 players representing an opposing army, plus the referee, the individual holding the red cards, whose job it is to interpret what happens. Prussian success in the German wars of unification caused the other military powers to take notice of this, and they developed their own versions, most notably Strategos, which is the American version. This will come up later. But the first commercially available set of rules for wargaming, however, is Little Wars by H.G. Wells. There he is. Published ominously in 1913, or to give it its full title, Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. Wells was something of a progressive for the time.
It's almost not misogynistic.
It's not age well.
It is not aged well. The game was exceptionally primitive by modern standards. It did not use dice or any sort of computation to resolve combat, and it used toy soldiers, which were readily available to customers at the time, and could more or less almost always be found in toy chests of most middle-class families' households. Here's a picture of Peter Cushing playing a game on his living room carpet. I just thought you'd benefit from a picture of Peter Cushing. But wargaming only really took off after the Second World War. The First World War kind of made it a little bit unfashionable. So wargaming in this period was rather different from what we know today, which is dominated, of course, by Games Workshop. There really wasn't any sort of commercial market until Avalon Hill came around, which by the time of the 1970s was only one of a few wargaming firms out there that had enough revenue to maintain a modest full-time staff. So in 1954, Charles S. Roberts self-financed his first wargame, Tactics. Compared to other board games on the market, it was a deeper, more serious game aimed at adults with an interest in military history. He formed Avalon Hill and followed this up with the immensely popular Gettysburg. Now, Avalon Hill's products were board games. They were boxed sets. You had a box, cardboard, board, that's the word I'm looking for, counters, dice, and a slim pan. It's a board game. You don't need me to explain that. However, others continued in the spirit of H.G. Wells with miniature wargaming. Here's another picture of Peter Cushing with his enormous collection of, to say they're miniatures, they're not toys, they're miniatures. It's a serious grown-up adult hobby. Yes.
He used to paint his own.
He did, yes.
Oh, that's very good. Thank you very much. Yes.
I think he retired from the field.
Yes.
He'll be back.
What was that? Yes, so miniature wargaming was a bit of a niche within a niche. Most people, in America at least, played Avalon Hill products. In the UK, this was more popular. In America, well, as I said, it was a bit of a niche hobby. Manufacturers of miniatures, not toys, had a vested interest in the availability of rules with which to play with their products. They would often give away rules for free or close to free to encourage sales, and they supported magazines to disseminate rules and advertise their own products. What you had is a lot of local clubs dotted around the country that didn't have much to do with each other. They would, individual hobbyists would try and make up rules for the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil Wars, share it amongst their friends, and they were considered very lucky if a magazine came along, published their rules, and they would get pocket money. So this, of course, is where Gary Gygax comes in. He was something of a de facto patriarch of the miniature wargaming community in Lake Geneva in Wisconsin in the 1960s. He was a 30-something-year-old man with a wife and kids in a scene that was largely populated by teenagers and college students. Wargaming for him was a passion, and I don't mean that in the awful trite way we see in job applications where they say you must have a passion for Microsoft Excel. I really mean passion. He would spend up to 3 hours a day gaming, between writing articles, designing rules, and play-by-mail games. He would often have to take what he called retirements away from his favourite hobby in order to spend time with his family.
By that stage, probably wishing.
He would, however, go on to find time to work on his hobby at his job, where he worked as an underwriter for the Fireman's Fund Insurance Company. At first, during his lengthy commute to and from the office in Chicago, but this would inevitably escalate. Now, in 1967, he planned a gaming convention on behalf of the International Federation of Wargaming in Pennsylvania. This was a failure, but he followed up with a second one in New York and a third one closer to home in Lake Geneva in 1968. Now, this one was a success. It brought in more members, was favourably reported in the press, demonstrated that he was capable of organising a profitable convention, and established Lake Geneva as a centre for the hobby. This is the origins of what is now called Gen Con. It's still going on. I think it's in Indiana now. The other fellow whose name is on the book is, of course, Dave Arneson. Now, he's from the neighbouring twin cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul in Minnesota. And as an aside, I had no idea where these places are. I had to look them up on a map.
Minnesota borders Canada, it's the very northern mid part of the
Yes.
States. And yeah, you've got Wisconsin on one side and Canada on the north.
Yeah.
Minneapolis borders in the south of the state. I've been there many, many times. I used to work for a company there.
Okay. When I looked it up on the map, it occurred to me that the American Midwest is a lot further east than I thought it would be. So,
Not to them.
not to them. So, Dave was is about a decade younger than Gygax. He was a student in the University of Minnesota and participated heavily in his school's Napoleonic War miniatures games. Hello.
Hello.
He was a member of the Midwest Military Simulation Association. You'll find these clubs often picked very grandiose titles for themselves. He edited,
It's a serious adult hobby.
because it's a serious adult hobby, yes.
Not playing with toy soldiers.
Not playing with toy soldiers, we're simulating military things.
Yeah.
He edited the group's newsletter, The Corner of the Table. He met Gary in Gen Con in 1969. Here's Gen Con in 1969, I think. They
The guy at the back looks really bored.
Yes. I'm not sure if the bottle of Coke is in play, but yeah. The two seemed to hit it off, and they began corresponding at length about their shared hobby, and collaborated on a naval military war game for the early 19th century called Don't Give Up the Ship. Arneson also produced miniatures for this. Now, too far. Gygax had another brief retirement from gaming to focus on Christian ministry. He was a Jehovah's Witness. Yeah. But each time he took a break from the hobby, he'd find himself almost making up for lost time. He established a neighbourhood club, 7 people, including his childhood friend Don Kay, and they adopted the title of the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association. They met every Saturday to play miniature war games we had a table which was filled with sand, and you could mould hills, valleys, any sort of terrain. Actually, the first version of Kriegspiel was played on a sand table like that, but because the king was interested, he can't present the king with a table full of sand. He had one made of porcelain. So back to the 60s. He also set up the Castle and Crusade Society, which reflected his growing interest in medieval warfare. Now, this was a national club, but it only had dozens of members at the time. Arneson was one of the first people to join. Gygax also edited their newsletter, The Doomsday Book. Now, in 1970, Gygax lost his job. He was using company stationery for wargaming correspondence and for printing copies of the issues of the Doomsday Book. We've all been there. And in case my boss is watching, I do not do that.
I used to read the NSC newsletter in the office.
where was I? Yes, this obviously freed up a lot of time for his favourite hobby, but he had a wife and 4 children, soon to be 5, to support. As I established, it's very difficult to make any kind of meaningful money in wargaming, especially just by producing rules. But he felt he had little choice but to give it a go. By his own reckoning, the job prospects in Lake Geneva weren't to his liking. So his first publisher was a man called Don Lowry, whom he had met at Gen Con. He owned a mail order business that happened to earn enough to support his family, and Don wanted to move into the rule publishing business anyway, under the imprint of Guidon Games. So Gygax worked on a few products for him, most notable of which is Chainmail. Now Chainmail is actually a good example of how people made rules back then. It was first created by Jeff Heron as a 4-page pamphlet. It was then heavily edited and expanded by Gygax and published in Panzerfaust magazine. It was later published as a set of mass combat rules for medieval warfare in the Doomsday Book, and this then became the core to the first edition of Chainmail, as we see here. I love this tagline, wargaming with miniatures.
In inverted commas.
In inverted. In addition to extra things like jousting and dueling, it had a fantasy supplement, which introduced both fantasy elements, wizards, dragons, magic, and so forth. And what I find quite funny is that it was controversial at the time. Again, serious, adult, grown-up hobby that should not be sullied by such childish fantasy. Of course, these days, the market is dominated by Games Workshop and its Warhammer Fantasy series. So there we are. Technically, it wasn't the first set of fantasy rules for gaming. Leonard Patt's Rules for Middle-earth, published in The Courier, beats it to it. So the fantasy supplement contains a lot of things that would become staples of Dungeons & Dragons. It was something of a grab bag of different fantasy elements, Tolkien, obviously, but also Michael Moorcock and Paul Anderson. In particular, he lifted what we call the alignment system. So monsters were grouped into being on the side of law or chaos. This then morphed into the alignment system in Dungeons & Dragons, in which your character's entire moral outlook on life is expressed on a 2-way axis of good, evil, law, and chaos. Everybody's favourite spell, Fireball, comes from here, amongst others. The concept of heroic characters, which are more powerful than basic units, and they had different levels of power. Magic users were also differentiated by different levels of power, and they were limited by what spells they could cast accordingly. And monsters such as basilisks, chimerae, giants, and rules for magic weapons and armour. Now, despite being a bit controversial, it opened up a new and untested market that proved to be surprisingly popular. It turned out people actually wanted a bit of childish fantasy in their games. However, it only earned Gygax a few dollars in profit. So in August of 1971, he had to take up shoe repair in order to sustain himself. Now we continue to work with Arn.
Still a minister at this point.
I don't think he was a minister. He was a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses, but I don't think he did any ministry at this point. He remained a Jehovah's Witness right up until things started to go downhill in the 80s. And that might be a tale for another talk, but he was drinking caffeine. Amongst other things. So he continued to collaborate with Dave Arneson on a number of projects as part of Guidon Games, including Don't Give Up the Ship. However, this partnership nearly came to ruin over a dispute about royalties, with Dave Arneson refusing to provide any more work for Guidon Games until Don Lowry paid him. Disputes about royalties will become a recurring theme in the history of Dungeons & Dragons. By the end of 1972, Gygax had made plans for the 3rd edition of Chainmail. However, by this point he had read something quite interesting in The Corner of the Table and the Doomsday Book. Dave Arneson's report on something called Blackmoor, which involved sending squads of fantasy heroes underground to explore dungeons. So we're going to have to go slightly back in time. This is 1966. The person we're looking for is Dave Wesley, who I've been told is far left in the picture. He is another prominent member of the Midwest Military Simulation Association, and he is the man who rediscovered Strategos in the university's libraries. Now, Strategos was a variation of Kriegspiel, 2 players plus a referee who mediated anything weird going on. He developed something called Braunstein as an experiment in 1969. It was set in a fictional German town during the Napoleonic Wars, fending off a French invasion. It was a multiplayer, multi-objective game with individual roles for individual players. So I think Dave Arneson played a university student in the town, but there were roles for the town mayor, the university's bursar. Originally, players were supposed to communicate with the referee in a separate room. But what happened is people started talking to each other as their characters. They were role-playing. He regarded this as a chaotic failure. But this seemed to strike a chord with the club, and a second version involved players supporting or averting a coup d'etat in the fictional troubled South American Republic of Banania.
Very culturally sensitive.
The inner guardian in me is just outraged by it. Whatever.
As I said, serious grown-up hobby. Another member of the club, Dwayne Jenkins, refereed a Wild West spin-off called Brown Stone, in which Arneson played a Mexican bandit called El Poncho. So the key innovation of Brownstone is a sense of continuity between games into a campaign. So what happened in one session directly affects what happens in the next one. I believe they burnt down the town in one game, so they had to deal with the consequences of that in the second session. Now, in 1971, when David Wesley went off to join the military, Dave Arneson developed a fantasy version of Braunstein set in the barony of Blackmore, which was part of a shared fantasy world being developed by the Castle and Crusade Society for their chainmail games. And incidentally, this is what would become Greyhawk. It was inspired by the Conan stories and Gothic horror. It involved a town, a castle, and a multi-layered dungeon. Players controlled individual characters who could progress and become more powerful as they gained experience by slaying monsters, acquiring loot, and completing objectives. Cooperative play was encouraged to achieve all of that. It used a modified version of chainmail for combat. It integrated the Avalon Hill game Outdoor Survival for overworld adventures, by which I mean move around a map representing the countryside, and every so often you roll a dice to see what happens. This is where we get the concept of random encounters from. So the next time you're sitting around a table, Dungeon Master rolls a dice, smiles to himself, and announces a red dragon is swooping down to ruin your day. Blame Avalon Hill. The use of the referee persisted all through the Braunstein experiments, which meant that almost anything could be attempted as long as the referee could adjudicate on it. Now, Dave Arneson visited Gygax in late 1972 to demonstrate Dave McGarry's prototype board game, The Dungeons of Patakada, which Gygax wanted to evaluate for publication by Guidon Games. TSR would eventually publish this as Dungeon! In 1975. Dave then demonstrated Blackmore, and Gygax was instantly hooked. Rob Kuntz, who would later work with Gygax, described it as I can't do an accent, so I'm not going to bother. Gary, myself, and a few other local wargamers were the first lucky fellows from Lake Geneva to experience the rigours of Blackmore. This idea caught on deeply with Gary after an exciting adventure in which our party of heroes fought a troll, were fireballed by a magic user, then fled outdoors, being chased by the magic user and his minions, fought 4 Balrogs, followed and mapped to 16 ogres and destroyed them with a wish from a sword we had procured from the hapless troll earlier. So already sounds like the average session of Dungeons & Dragons. So Gygax came down with the mumps and began exploring the ideas while he was recovering. The idea of measured progression, experience points, and the addition of games taking place in a dungeon maze. He started running his own adventures with the Lake Geneva crowd, centering around a castle called Greyhawk in their shared universe thing. By April 1973, Gygax proposed to Arneson that they collaborate on developing this dungeon concept into a commercial product for Guidon Games that he tentatively titled The Fantasy Game. As far as I know, there are two competing stories about where the name Dungeons and Dragons comes from. It's either Gary's wife or his 2-year-old daughter who pick it out of a list of prospective names. At this stage, there's no indication at all that this would be anything other than a slim little pamphlet of rules, just like everything else he had published at the time. Gary remained in hope that his work through Guide on Games would provide him with a stable income, and he even started planning a move to Maine, which is where Don Lowry was planning to set up shop. Lowry, however, ran into a bit of trouble, and by May 1973, it became clear that Guide on Games was not going to publish anything at all. So, with Gen Con, his reputation, and a back catalogue of work for Guide on Games, Gygax was about as well placed as one could possibly be to set up a new business. He just needed money. So $1,000 from his friend Don Kay was enough to set up Tactical Studies rules. Don Kay would handle the money, Gary Gygax would handle the rules. That's their first logo, G for Gygax, K for K. TSR's first debut, however, was not D&D, it was Cavaliers and Roundheads. Gygax and Arneson collaborated over mail, sending copies of the rules back and forth. However, they started to fall out towards the end. They disagreed heavily about the final rules draft. Gygax repeatedly pushed back against Arneson's additions in quite a snippy tone as well, saying that they didn't cohere with the developing system. All of the editing took place in Lake Geneva, and Dave Arneson himself did not see the final draft until it went to press. As he put it later, it was very much a case of me providing various ideas and concepts, but not having any say as to how they were used. It seemed that no one was confident of D&D's success. They called it a $300 idea. It's just another product to them. In addition to D&D, Gygax and company continued to work on other products, including one based on Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom stories called The Warriors of Mars. Now, what was going to be a simple pamphlet ballooned into 3 booklets: Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, all packaged in neat little wood-grain boxes. It had grown massively over budget, forcing Kay and Gygax to secure an investment from someone called Melvin Bloom for an equal partnership. This would come back to haunt Gygax later. Now, printing D&D had drained TSR's funds, so they had to rely on acquiring and reselling older Guide on Games rules in order to stay afloat. There was no money left for art, so they had to hire teenagers to produce drawings for a few dollars each. These are some of my personal favourites. A very concerned orc who would be concerned because his arm has been dislocated. Some sort of ethnic stereotyping here. Sassy wraith, asparagus, and I'm certain that barbarian has been traced from a comic book. So by modern standards, original Dungeons & Dragons is very different. It's much closer to its original wargaming roots. Your characters are almost disposable. Do not expect them to survive. There are only 3 classes to start with: fighting men, and were men, magic users, and clerics. You also had dwarves, elves, and hobbits, later renamed to halflings after a cease and desist from the Tolkien estate. Experience was granted more for acquiring loot than for slaying monsters, which encouraged players to avoid needless combat. And the way the rules were written is very, very difficult to pass. It assumes you have an existing knowledge of how wargaming works, how you're supposed to read all of the various charts and tables. It's difficult to find any guidance on how combat even works. It states that combat is to be detailed in Volume 3, which says that melee can be conducted with a combat table given in Volume 1, or by the chainmail system. The words "as per chainmail" appear an awful lot. So not only were you expected to buy this, you were expected to buy a copy of chainmail as well. Incidentally, $10 in 1974 was an exorbitant amount of money to charge for a couple of booklets. It didn't even come with a polyhedral dice. So initial sales were very slow. Nobody really had any idea what it was. The rules didn't really explain what it was. It's only really after Gen Con in 1974, and although it's difficult to really establish cause and effect, it's likely that learning about the game directly from Gygax and friends encouraged new players to buy the box, go home, tell their friends what this thing really is about, and word of mouth spread that way. You start to have magazine articles detailing local campaigns, which sparked further interest. Pages of stuff together. So this necessitated a second printing in the white box of 1,000 copies at the end of 1974, which sold out quickly enough for TSR to have to strike a deal with Heritage, a miniatures company based in Dallas. D&D had truly arrived. Now, I could go on describing the ups and downs, the satanic panic, Gygax's inevitable downfall, but to be here all night, so I think it's a good place to stop it. So, I think I've charted where all of these key ideas I identified at the start came from. The identification of one player with one character from the Brownstein experiments, the fantasy setting from the Chainmail fantasy supplement, campaigns from the Brownstone game, character progression from Brownstein, and the open-ended gameplay technically has been around since Kriegspiel and the Prussians. So, there we go.
Tell us about Gygax's downfall.
Oh God.
That's what we all want to hear about.
Yeah, so basically Don Kay, his friend, died, which left all of his shares in the ownership of his wife, who had no interest in gaming and wanted rid of them. So they had, and at this point,
The guy from Guido, right?
Don Kay is his friend, who gave him $1,000 to start TSR. Yeah, as a seed fund. This was a time where TSR still needed lots of money. They hadn't really, success hadn't really quite come yet. So he had to sell the funds. Shares had to be sold to somebody called Melvin Bloom. No, his father, Brian Bloom, sorry. And which meant that Gygax was no longer in control of the company anymore. He was a minority shareholder. It suited him fine. He wanted to concentrate on gaming. He was not a businessman. The Blooms wanted rid of Gygax at some point. They sent him to California to work on the cartoon, Dungeons & Dragons cartoon, and a film which was supposed to star Orson Welles, which I really wish got made. Would have loved to see that. When he came back, he realised the Blooms had completely mismanaged the company. It was in massive amounts of debt. They tried to bring up a shipwreck for some reason. So he hired somebody called Lorraine Williams as managing director while he did a bit of investigation. The Blooms then sold their stock to Lorraine Williams, now the majority shareholder, who kicks out Gygax.
Had they made the advanced Dungeons and Dragons by this stage?
Yeah, so this was, I think it was the 80s. So Advanced Dungeons and Dragons had definitely been published. Lorraine Williams apparently didn't think much of gamers. It's generally not a good sign if the head of your company doesn't.
In the business then.
I'm not sure. All that I really know about her is that she owns the intellectual property for the Buck Rogers. She wanted TSR to focus on that for some weird reason, and they carried on with D&D, fortunately. There's a story going around that she banned playtesting because it was playing games on company time. But it's one of those stories that seems just a little bit too insane. You can't not test your product.
Exactly.
So do people nowadays play with the book? Is it online?
It's either or. They still sell, the requisite rule books. You can still meet in person. However, the internet has opened it up. I myself play a weekly session on Tuesdays on the internet because people have selfishly moved out of London. So we have to do it online.
So we like through Zoom or something like that?
Yeah, through Zoom. There's a variety of other products dedicated to tabletop role-playing games, Roll20, Fantasy Grounds, I believe. Yeah, there's a lot out there.
So there are now lots of cosplay conventions as well, linked to the games.
Well, there's also the interesting about LARP as well.
Yeah.
So LARP is a kind of offshoot of this as well. LARP is live action
swords.
dress up
Yeah.
as a mage, as a priest, as a
And then
fighter,
you go,
whatever,
Yeah.
and then go with other real people also dressed up with these characters or monsters or
Real.
whatever.
Yeah.
Luigi does.
Luigi does that. Luigi does that. Yeah. And so LARP is the show, and you basically hit people with your rubber sword. You know, if you have double damage, you go double. So the referee, the umpire can.
Sounds like my ex-wife.
So it's become quite a large industry now.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
as you say, the whole Games Workshop empire is built on this family thing.
Absolutely.
I started playing D&D back in the late 70s myself.
Right.
Yeah, me too.
So yeah, that's the time. It was,
Well, what I think is interesting for the benefit of those who haven't done it is that on the one hand it's a game, but by the time involved in what I was doing, it was a game in which the referee really could do whatever he wanted to, he or she.
Yes.
So it was more like, and I think it was probably what appealed to me, was that he was
God,
creating a narrative. No, he was creating a narrative, and it only worked if he could do it well enough to keep the players engaged and feel that they were involved.
Yeah.
You know, if they felt that the world was just pointless and whatever they did, terrible thing would happen to them, they disengaged.
It's like a
So
collaborative novel.
yes, and I think the skill in doing it right was creating something which kept them interested. But if you relied entirely on the roll of dice, then you could go down an unsatisfactory narrative route. So the referee could basically overrule whatever the dice said. You often hear the referee do rolling dice, but how he interpreted that was up to him.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes it revolutionary. It's a game in only the loosest sense. It's a game. It's a storytelling.
more of an unfolding narrative.
Yes, it's like a group. Yes.
Yeah, and
Storytelling
you're
exercise.
playing one of the actors, it's almost like a play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're an actor in a play, taking on a particular role, with a particular thing, and the dungeon master is the person, the puppet master.
He's the editor.
He's the editor, but also director.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
My brother designs games, and they have games events every Monday, but they also do it online on Sundays and Wednesdays, so it gets quite involved. And then you get doctors going along, and surgeons, you get people in IT, you get people from all kinds of professions who just use it to forget work.
But the role of the dungeon master is critical to keep the players engaged. You have to make sure that, yes, you're rolling some dice to do some decision making, stuff like that in the background, the housekeeping, but you're also having to use your mind as you go as well. So yes, you've got a basic story, yes, you've got a basic scenario, but you're then trying to embellish it, you're trying to make it interesting for the players involved as well. So
And to create tension and
yeah,
a sense
yeah.
that they are doing something.
Yeah, and also judging the balance of play as well. If you have them encounter overwhelming odds, which wipes them out, that discourages them. If you keep having them make it life too easy, again, it doesn't make that to play. So you, as a dungeon master, you really are manipulating their reality to provide the engaging environment. And this is all up here. I mean, this back in the 70s, it's all about people coming together, discussing what's happening, literally unfolding narrative.
I want to take it that it's, I only encountered it briefly, my recollection was 10 minutes. It didn't
I
grab
wish
my-
you'll do a talk.
it didn't grab my imagination.
But did it have Nazis?
No, it didn't. It's probably more of a reflection on me, but I mean, this was late. I imagine that it was like the late 80s, early 90s, that it was at its peak, or is its peak now? Or, I mean, in light of everything else that's available with regard to computers, internet, online gaming, and all the rest of it, I mean, is it still ridiculously popular, or did it have its heyday?
I think when computers came in, it became probably less popular. There were other things to do.
No, because I played the D&D computer games, and I would never touch D&D with basketball because I was a serious miniature wargamer.
Exactly.
And at the age of 16, looked down on these irritating young mucks who were mucking around with massive
So you had the rulers out, you had the
orcs
rulers
and
out.
all the rest of it. Yeah, exactly. And my definition of miniature, by the way, was something made out of lead rather than something made out of plastic. It was a very
I have
snobbish.
plastic system.
Toy was plastic, lead was a miniature. And I had a girlfriend who worked on a 1990s.
And yet you had a girlfriend.
And you mentioned, Stuart mentioned the whole scripting thing. Well, they were scripting it because they couldn't kill off too many contestants because they paid for them to be there for 7 days. So the whole, and Patrick Moore thought was his way of getting in touch with the younger generation at the time, and he loved doing it.
I suppose to answer that question,
Right, you're all fired.
oh, sorry, you've been hard.
So, now my era would have been second edition, Aidan.
Yes.
Vintage darling.
Really, early 90s.
Yes.
So I've been out of touch with it for a long time, but keeping a sort of a bit of an eye on the associated genre literature,
Yeah.
the sort of things that people like Stan Nichols started doing in the mid-90s, reappraising orcs
Yeah.
as not always the bad guy. Is that kind of thinking of angles on it, very different narratives than we had, where orcs were always an NPC and always inherently evil? Is that feeding back into the game nowadays?
Yeah. So you're going to get me ranting now. Should point out with with the Dungeon Master, of course, they can tweak the reality of what's going on. So in my group, we played a few games. Like I said, at the beginning, the Dungeon Master said, right, we're doing an old school game. All orcs are bastards and they're going to die, essentially. Where Wizards of the Coast, which now publishes Dungeons and Dragons, have moved, it's a bit more of a slightly kid-friendly, politically correct way. So orcs are now a proper player character race. No, species. They're not races anymore, they're species. Yes. And I mean,
Dare I ask what the difference is? No,
don't. It's going to open a whole can of worms.
Worms are species too.
Worms are a species too. Yes. Hold on. In the latest edition of the Player's Handbook, published last year, they have introduced orcs as a playable race, a species, and in the blurb, they also have a bit of description. Elves are live, pointy-eared, dwarves live underground, have beards. Orcs are apparently Native Americans who live in peace and harmony with all that.
Much more Viking culture.
Yes. I mean, this is what gets me annoyed, because I'm not against the idea of playing an orcish character. I think that's a great role-playing idea. Yeah, if the Dungeon Master sits down, okay, you're playing an orc, people are going to hate you, you're going to have to prove yourself. It's just how the setting works. But to completely gloss over that is, that annoys me slightly. Yep.
So, as many of you know, I was in the Midwest in the 80s, and there were a lot of young men playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
And if you look at the Venn diagram, playing Dungeons and Dragons, knew how to code, which was relatively rare in those days, and smoked a lot of dope.
Yeah.
There was a big overlap. Is that still the case, or is that becoming too?
I mean, I don't smoke dope or know how to code. So I think, without getting a bit too into identity politics, back then, of course, it appealed to white middle-class boys. Now, has of course opened up to a much wider audience. I mean, one weird.
Fantasy genre, right? Because that used to be a very nerdy boy thing.
Yes.
And now it seems to be much more general interest.
Oh yeah, I think TV shows like Stranger Things have opened it up to a newer, younger audience. That's more people.
Everybody loves a witch.
Yes. Actually, I think was it Dragon Magazine? No, Dragon Magazine produced shortly after this was made rules for playing women in Dungeons and Dragons.
They did rules for playing women.
Yes, because they thought no women would actually play, so they needed specific rules to play female characters. So your charisma score was now your beauty score. Magic users were called witches, and there's a whole host of weird rules that everybody involved now mercifully thinks of as a.
Menstruation.
Yes.
I was going to say, not nice.
Yes, but product of its time and all that. Well, even by the standards of the 1970s, it's a bit dodgy.
Well, it's like, I think we kept you long enough now. I think we should go and have a drink.